All right. Thank you for the first part of this meeting. And now we are really happy and proud to be presenting this special panel of leaders from the National Institutes of Health. And, it's like a bunch of superstars. We need Professor Xavier here from the X-Men to unite them all. But they've all been working together on neuroscience-related issues, including things like the Brain Initiative, and they're esteemed experts. So they are at the pinnacle of our biomedical research agency, the NIH. And one of our top priorities at the ABC is to support neuroscience research efforts and initiatives and institutes across the NIH. And this is a main purpose of our advocacy in looking to get support for brain research. So we are really grateful for their fellowship and partnership and thank them for joining us today. What I'd like to do to start off is to make a few introductions. You should see in front of you some pictures of our esteemed guests. I'm going to start with Dr. Cernick, Dr. Allison Cernick. She's the Deputy Director of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, known as the NICHD. She started in that role in September last year, and what she does is to assist the director in overseeing all programs supporting research on child development, developmental biology, nutrition, HIV and AIDS, intellectual and developmental disability, population dynamics, reproductive biology, contraception, pregnancy, and medical rehabilitation. So that's a lot to keep track of. So thanks very much, Dr. Cernick. Next, let me introduce Dr. Josh Gordon. He's been a great friend to us. He's the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, the NIMH. He actually gave a beautiful Congressional Neuroscience Caucus on July 29th. So this is the lead federal agency for research in medical disorders. And Dr. Gordon has an extensive research portfolio, and it's basic and it's clinical and it's translational. And the idea is to transform the understanding and treatment of mental illnesses, and of course, getting to prevention and recovery and cure, which of course is very important to our constituents in the ABC. Next, I want to mention that we are privileged to have Dr. Richard Hodis join us. He's the director of the National Institutes of Aging. He's a leading researcher in immunology. He's been at the NIA for some time. He was named to lead it, I believe, in 1993. And he leads all federal aging NIA efforts in what amounts to a really strong portfolio on innovative ways for conducting research in aging, sharing data, and translating findings into practice. So thanks very much, Dr. Hodis, for joining us from the NIA. Also want to introduce Dr. Walter Koroshetz. Walter was selected to lead the NINDS in 2015, though he'd been there for a while. Since 2007, he was a deputy director. Before that, he was a neurologist at Harvard and did stroke and neurocritical care. And he's been had a seminal role in multiple programs of relevance to us. He is working very closely with the NIH Brain Institute, the Traumatic Brain Injury Center, and that involves a silo-spanning effort between NIH intramural programs and Uniform Health Services University. And he's done multi-year work to establish an NIH Office of Emergency Care Research that coordinates emergency care with research training. And that's a big portfolio as well. Thank you, Walter. I want to make a shout out to Dr. Donald Lowe, who we met, I think, in June and July when we talked about collaborating with NCATS, which is the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, that gives the CTSA awards on issues related to drug development and repurposing. So he is responsible for planning and directing a broad and comprehensive program there. It's in preclinical development, optimization of processes, looking at things like drug metabolism, toxicology, pharmacology, formulation development, chemistry, natural history studies, biomarker development. So he is very technically adept and attuned to programs that are very important for developing cures for our patients. So thank you, Dr. Lowe, for representing NCATs. And then I wanted to mention Dr. Nora Volkoff, and she's a physician who leads NIDA, which is the National Institute on Drug Abuse. So NIDA has this critical role of supporting the world's research on health aspects of drug use and addiction. Her work has been instrumental in showing that addiction is a disease of the human brain. As a psychiatrist and scientist, she's pioneered using brain imaging to investigate toxic addictive properties of drugs of abuse. We've heard a lot about them lately. So what a wonderful group of folks to help us. And we have some questions for them. And I'm hoping that we can have a panel here today that is cooperative, that can riff on each other's comments. I want to invite people from the audience to also ask questions, and you can do that in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them. But let me address some questions now to the full panel. And they are, what are some current and future initiatives for your institute that might be ripe for partnership with the ABC and the members who we talked about a little bit earlier? Along those lines, what do you see as the area for greatest opportunity for your research portfolio? And how can we from the ABC be involved? So we're very interested in a synthetic and collaborative discussion today. We know that you've all worked together before, spanning silos, working on things like the Brain Initiative together. So if you remember those questions, let me throw them out to you and ask, who wants to chime in first?
Well, I can chime in first if you want me to, because it's actually, I was inspired at ABC. I mean, obviously, I think that one of the initiatives that has been quite transformative is the ABCD initiative. And that's the project which actually is done among multiple institutes at the NIH, including NIMH and NICHD, as well as the Alcohol Institute, that aims to prospectively investigate 12,000, or close to 12,000 children, 9 to 10, as they transition into adulthood. And the data is being released periodically and has enabled basically a very fast distribution and utilization to understand how the human brain develops, and very importantly, how socioeconomic and factors influence its development, as well as adverse other adverse environmental insults, not necessarily just linked with socioeconomics, like lead. And it has also enabled the development of new models for analyzing complex data sets. And as these young adolescents, adults transition into later stages of adolescence, we're going to start to see the emergence of mental illness. And in fact, there have already been publications trying to address and predict which children are going to be at higher risk of psychosis. We're also in the process, again, in close partnership with NIMH and other institutes like NICHD, to launch an equivalent, but that will start in infancy and follow developmental trajectories of children. In that particular project, we are going to actually also oversample for children that have been exposed during pregnancy to opioids, but also oversample children that are brought up in very adverse socioeconomic backgrounds. So that's, and that project, which goes by the name of HPCD, has launched the pilot phase with 27 centers. And because it launched actually just before COVID, it has also placed them in a unique position to try to understand, for example, and recruit, and they've already started to get data on this, on how viral infection during pregnancy influences the development of the brain. And so that is, again, an extraordinary opportunity for all of us to partner, because obviously the basis for mental illness and including addictions it's driven at these very, very sensitive stages. So I want to leave it at there because I just wanted to highlight these two projects.
Thanks so much, Dr. Volkoff. Let me just have a follow-up question. You mentioned your ability to look in your study before and after COVID-19 began. Do you have the latest evidence on whether substance abuse disorders might put people at greater risk for COVID-19? I'm guessing you'll say yes, but is there anything you wanted to say to augment that?
Yeah, no, and studies actually from using electronic health records have shown indeed that individuals with a history of a diagnosis of a substance use disorder, much greater risk for getting COVID, and if they get COVID, for having much worse outcomes. And that's just in general population. I mean, obviously what we also want to know, because I don't think we can be complacent on this one based on what we know from the Spanish flu, that there were consequences to brain development with infants that were born of women who were infected. So I think that we have to follow up. And then the issue relevant to your question is, well, what happens if you have a combination? If not just that the mother got COVID during pregnancy, but also she was abusing drugs. And we will follow up. I mean, by the nature of the prevalences, this is going to be happening among the women that are recruited as part of the HPCD.
Thank you, Dr. Volkoff. I would ask any of our other panelists if they want to follow up. I'm thinking that Dr. Cernick might, since a few developmental issues came up.
Right, and I want to say, so we've partnered with Nora and her institute, not only on this, but on a number of other projects related to pregnancy as well as children through some of the trans NIH groups that we have, and have offered a number of supplements to augment the studies that we currently have ongoing to understand COVID. And in addition, we are also working collaboratively to look at how we expand the ability to provide the same types of testing that we have in the NIH toolbox. So through the Blueprint program, we've received funding to expand down the capabilities in the NIH toolbox and to include motor assessment that can be using computerized technologies that may allow us to extend some of our research in development down further. So we're looking down to 2 years of age for some of those projects, and we've had a successful virtual kickoff of that project this past spring, obviously changed from our original plan of doing that in person. We've also done some, in conjunction with some of the HBCD work and with Blueprint support, we also held a workshop this past spring to look at neuroimaging in populations, including pediatric populations, and how we better adjust to special populations, including children with neurologic conditions that make neuroimaging more difficult. And to that end, we also have had the opportunity to look at some of the studies that we have in the field and provide supplements to them. And specifically, one of our grantees that is looking at intellectual and developmental disabilities, excuse me, he always finds a way to do that when I'm talking. So the key thing there is that we are starting to understand from studies that the risk of mortality, especially for individuals with Down syndrome, is pretty much higher than any population. A recent publication tends to suggest that there is a much more significant risk for severe disease as well as mortality in studies that are emerging from Europe, and there are some new studies that we are going to be seeing from the United States. So I think we have a significant concern about children with conditions that are intellectual disabilities, and the need to better study the impact on them. So, I will stop there as it relates to some of our ongoing projects related to non-COVID, but also the way that they can potentially contribute to COVID. and really do appreciate the collaboration of all the folks on this call.
Thanks, Dr. Cernick. Maybe I could follow up and ask, what you think are the most exciting advancement in children's brain health that you're seeing on the horizon?
I think the things that we are understanding now, and I think we have sort of a unique opportunity to understand this. One, we've been looking a lot at nutrition and the impact of various early interventions in nutrition and their impact on brain health. The other is that we are starting to try to pivot some of our studies to look at the impact both of the virtual learning space and the isolation that that's causing, and then also the impacts of physical activity and the increases potentially in obesity and their interaction with cognitive development. So I think we will sadly understand a little bit more about the value of some of the social determinants of brain health that we may not have understood as well. So I think we're bringing something a little bit different than the basic biology, but we also have some interesting new work coming out related to our developmental biology branch, looking at some of the various ways that the brain can influence development and how we can improve cognition. Specifically, even our Institute Director's Lab has had some really exciting recent findings about how to improve cognition perinatally in Down syndrome. And so I think we have some new ways to use treatments potentially to improve brain health even before birth. And I think these are some exciting developments that are coming forward now.
Thank you, Dr. Cernick. I would ask who wants to speak next, but I'm also thinking that when we talk about developmental issues, I think about regenerative medicine and also neurodegeneration and the trajectory, from development across the lifespan of brain health and development of brain diseases. I wonder if Dr. Hodis might like to speak next.
Thank you. I'd be happy to. The National Institute on Aging has a great priority. The nervous system, the brain, and the changes that occur with normal aging and the changes that occur abnormally and tragically with disease. It certainly needs to be pointed out that of late the emphasis on Alzheimer's disease and other related dementias has resulted in an extraordinary increase in resources, happily at a time when scientific opportunities have expanded. So just by way of that background, to let people understand that in the past 5 years, the federal appropriation, largely through NIA for research on Alzheimer's and related dementias, has increased more than fourfold, and now this past fiscal year in the range of about $2.8 billion per year. And I do need to stress that this is also importantly being directed at the most basic of neuroscience of aging and development, as well as the way in which that development transitions into pathology. The funds that have had the opportunity to share across NIH and the colleagues on this meeting, as well as others, have been wonderful partners in it. So for example, in the past years, of the appropriations to NIA targeted for this area of research, in the range of some $300 million has actually gone out to support research funded by the other institutes. We're able to do that, and fortunately, the neuroscience community at NIH, with the leadership represented here, has been extraordinarily in this partnership. In terms of the science, the excitement has ranged from the most basic biology, discovery, having gone from about 4 genetic risk factors known a few years ago, now to some 50 or more, not just enumerating them, but understanding their mechanisms, and with modern omics, transcriptomics, and measures of network interactions through a modern era of computational biology, we have identified increasing numbers of targets for translation that now are in the stages of early clinical trials and will proceed to give us much needed new approaches to treatment. Do also want to pay attention to the importance of dealing with people living with dementia now and those who care for them. Just a huge impact, financial, emotional, in terms of public health. And to note that in addition to these biological studies that are ongoing, a major effort has been put into looking at means for providing care, long-term services for those living with dementia and caring for them. This is as much an area of research as the biology itself, and another in which we partnered across NIH. So that in particular, appreciate the connection with some of the advocate constituents, not just advocating for the science, but also making it clear the way the science is being directly translated to immediate as well as important future opportunities that serve the public, multiple of our constituencies and advocacies. And maybe we'll be getting to this in the second round too, but particularly want to thank you organizations and the advocate groups here for helping to make it possible for research to be supported and then translate, importantly, the truth and the importance of science and scientific findings to the communities.
Thank you, Dr. Hodes. Are you thinking about any ways of improving access to care, through NIH-supported investigations, to linking up with different community-related health centers and networks like practice-based research networks? How do you get discovery out into the community, and how do you engage people from the community and who are, maybe don't have access to care, they live rurally or in underserved urban areas, to get them to have access to clinical trials that are important for aging research, particularly now in this time of COVID where people are so isolated and lonely?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a great question and an important focus for us. As in many areas of research, there has been clear underrepresentation of the communities who are most affected by disease, and that includes neurodegenerative diseases and the dementias. So a major outreach effort is now in partnership across institutes and with other public agencies to try to communicate with populations and communities that will be able to participate better in research. I can mention some of the examples, a collaboratory, which has now become a network looking at pragmatic trials embedded in communities and research enterprises, which is piloting methods to do just precisely as you were saying, provide information about diagnostics, care, services through communities, and some very exciting partnerships now, just the early stages, a new initiative, are piloting new ways to contact and communicate more broadly. It's most important that we recruit, and I think all of my colleagues here would echo the same intensity of our commitment to try to recruit more diverse populations into research that has been the case in the past. Some success, not nearly enough, but I think with the new commitment we have, new technologies to communicate, and the help of organizations represented here, we have to do better.
Thank you, Dr. Hodes. I'd ask who wants to go next, but I see Dr. Gordon is lit up on my panel, and I would ask him to sort of respond to the original question, which was what current and future initiatives of your institute might be ripe for partnership with the ABC, what are areas of greatest opportunity, and what do you think about what Dr. Hodes just said about sort of linking up in the community? I know when you were speaking at the Congressional Neuroscience Caucus, we talked about loneliness as a problem and amplifying pre-existing psychiatric problems and creating new ones in this pandemic. Dr. Gordon? You might be on mute.
No, I am. I'll mention three things. I'll try to be quick. With regard to the community things, one of the things that we're engaged in right now, relevant to COVID and the community, is the RADx Up initiative. This is an initiative that's really a trans-NIH initiative. Several of the institutes around the table are engaged as well, that seeks to understand impediments to testing in minority and underserved and vulnerable communities across the U.S. For testing for COVID-19 and develop strategies to enhance the uptake of that testing. This I mentioned this initiative because it specifically partners with community-based organizations, and it's really across the United States to try to reach into these communities and develop strategies and test strategies for increasing test uptake. And I think that's going to have not just an impact in terms of increasing the availability and acceptability of testing strategies for COVID, but also, teach us how to improve our research reach into these communities. One of the big challenges for the vaccine testing, for example, was to increase the number of minorities taking place. And although, at least with the Moderna trial, that was somewhat successful, it's been a challenge across the board. So that's one thing specifically relevant to community-based that NIMH has been engaged in. And it's our expertise, particularly in the AIDS arena, testing behavioral strategies that block access to treatment, access to testing, access to evidence-based solutions. That's been helping out the Radix Up initiative. The second thing I want to tell you is also COVID related, and it's also relevant for communities, but moving a little bit more to the realm of understanding the impact of COVID, particularly in vulnerable populations. So we, and again, several other NIH initiatives, NIH institutes are spearheading an initiative called the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Impacts of COVID-19 in Vulnerable Populations Initiative. And this long-winded name of initiative actually supports now over 50 supplements to NIH grants, and soon, hopefully, a couple dozen new NIH grants seeking to understand the impacts of the pandemic, the impacts of the economic distress, and the impacts of the mitigation measures on a variety of outcomes, particularly with a focus on mental health relevant outcomes, and trying to parse out the relative contributions of things like lockdown measures, of things like masking, of things like job loss, et cetera, on these outcomes. And so we're hoping to be able to use the sort of natural experiment that's been foisted upon us by the lack of a coherent national strategy to understand which components of the response to COVID have been helpful and which of those have not been. And I think that's going to be very interesting and play out over the next couple of years. The third thing I want to tell you about is moving away from COVID and more directly into the realm of what NIMH is really interested in. As you all know, the NIA in particular and NINDS have engaged through the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health in the Accelerated Medicines Partnership, which is a series of public-private partnerships really to engage with the pharmaceutical industry and nonprofits to support research in specific areas that are ripe for translation. And we're really proud to announce in mid-September that NIMH has now joined the Accelerated Medicines Partnership to form an AMP schizophrenia, which is aimed at developing biomarkers, mechanistic biomarkers that can guide treatment trials for actually individuals at clinical high risk for schizophrenia. So this is a syndrome that occurs in the teenage and early adulthood years before the first episode of psychosis, which is a harbinger of psychosis, but also carries its own morbidity. And the companies are really interested in developing treatments that might target this syndrome, but also might forestall the development or decrease the impact of subsequent psychosis development. So we're really excited about this initiative. And I would point out that a cornerstone, going back to the original question on community engagement, cornerstone of the project is the development of a network of research sites that are actually embedded in federally funded community mental health centers that focus on early psychosis. So we're really excited about this initiative, and I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Dr. Gordon. That's very exciting. And I'm thinking that the last sort of discussion on academic partnerships spanning the foundation efforts spanning the NIA, NINDS, and NIMH for developing new research and cures is maybe relevant to what Dr. Lowe's expertise is at NCATS. He's been also part of our ABC Innovation Initiative for repurposing therapeutics for effective CNS treatments. He's got a very vibrant program under Dr. Chris Austin at NCATS. And Dr. Lowe, do you want to add in some comments related to the original question and some comments from your other colleagues?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And really kind of launching off of Josh's third main point also, the importance of really focusing on translation, not only the translation of important new therapies for patients, but the very process of translation itself, which is still so challenging. And despite the amazing amount of progress in biomedical research over the last decades, particularly in CNS research, sadly, we haven't really moved the needle as much as we'd like to in terms of the success rate of translating research findings or clinical observations into new drugs. So as many of you know, the failure rate, just to be perfectly frank, of new drugs that enter clinical trials is still around 90%. That is 90% of drugs that enter into clinical testing fail and never reach FDA approval. And last time I looked for drugs for brain diseases, I think we're lagging at the very end of it. So I think our failure rate still is something like 95%. And so NCATS was formed as a newest institute at NIH about 9 years ago, really trying to tackle the very problems that are endemic to translation itself. So I'm really excited that NCATS, that you invited NCATS to be part of the panel, because even though we're not focused on brain diseases per se, we certainly are focused on the very same problems that are encountered in translating new promising therapeutic ideas into clinical practice. And in fact, one of our focuses especially is on rare diseases, because if you consider rare diseases in the aggregate, even though a rare disease is defined as a disease affecting fewer than 200,000 patients in the United States, if you take all rare diseases together in the aggregate, and there are at least 7,000, if not 10,000 rare diseases, that comes to at least 30 million Americans. So we like to say that rare diseases are not rare at all. And in fact, among these rare diseases, at least a third, if not more, are diseases of the brain and nervous system. And so because we have a particular interest in attacking the translational problems encountered in rare diseases because of the lack of commercial proposition or value proposition in many or most of these cases, we wind up working a lot on brain diseases. So I would say on the research translation side at NCATS, probably, I would say maybe a third of our portfolio has always been in CNS disorders, some major ones such as neurodegeneration, epilepsy, neural traumas and such, but also always at least a dozen or more translational projects we have ongoing in rare diseases. So a long way of getting back to your first question. Since inception, we've really felt that a successful translational project, really understanding how to translate a new therapeutic idea into clinical practice is never just a scientific challenge or a pharmaceutical challenge or a technical challenge, but always requires a partnership between research scientists, pharmaceutical scientists, physicians, and patients and patient groups. And so the answer to your question is we truly depend on close partnerships with organizations like ABC and all of your members in building the partnerships and coalitions that we need to build a successful team and really being able to translate from research into pharmaceutical development, into clinical practice. So very pleased to be part of this panel.
Thank you. Did you want to say anything about any particular products that you're interested in repurposing right now to advance treatments for CNS disease? Or is it premature to ask that, or is it a fair question?
No, sure. I'd love to comment on that. I guess I think about it. We think about it in two main categories. So one would be a very classical way of looking at repurposing, namely, can you identify drugs that are already approved by the FDA for application in a different disease area, such as in a CNS disease? And our perspective or experience would be that as a field, we've gotten very good at that at the early discovery stages. That is by taking advantage of research in the cell or animal models of neurological diseases, the ability to set up a high throughput screen and animal models to really identify new candidates that for repurposing an FDA approved drug. That part is working really well. And in fact, our and others' efforts in COVID showed that works really well, really fast. But the huge challenge then of taking a research observation where an FDA-approved drug seems to work in a cell model or animal model, and then translating that, putting together all the safety, the PK, efficacy and manufacturing and formulation and drug product manufacturing issues, all the things we have to put together to present to FDA for approval. That so-called valley of death for drugs, which accounts for 90% of drug failures, that's still a major challenge in repurposing. So we are actively partnering with many different groups on repurposing discovery efforts and trying to develop common ways in which we can facilitate the path through this last valley of death. The other area is not repurposing per se, but really looking at how platforms that have already been FDA approved, so let's say an AAV gene therapy platform or an antisense oligo drug platform, these are beginning to show some really good clinical track record. And these are platforms that can be easily adapted, scientifically that is, to other disease areas, including rare diseases and including many neurological diseases. So it's not repurposing per se in terms of a drug, approved drug, but a repurposing of a platform for making approved drugs very quickly. So we have major efforts on the gene therapy side for AAV and ASO platform approaches to make those a lot more streamlined, faster, cheaper, and more accessible, particularly to rare disease patients where the kinds of resources you would normally need for a major drug development program tend to be scarce.
Thank you. It's fascinating. We have to think very much about the specific target for diseases, but we also have to think about the system that leads to the efforts that lead to the development of those drugs, which are involving team science and multiple organizations, and development of administrative and regulatory structures, which can be pretty complicated. We have plenty of problems at the level of just the university with sponsored programs and IRBs and the lawyers poking their noses in and spending a lot of extra time, and time is money, and there's opportunity costs. And I know the same thing happens at the larger federal level. And maybe this isn't a fair question, but do you have any thoughts about processes at the level of the FDA? And maybe it's not a fair question to ask because you're not there, but there's the idea of linking together the molecules, the regular old drugs, the larger biologicals, and the devices into one unit that's sort of related to getting through neurological cures along the lines of what's happened for oncology in the last several years, which hopefully has led to more drugs to more patients earlier than ever with better results. Any comments on the system? And because that's something we can advocate to change.
Well, as you say, I certainly can't comment on the regulatory, review side, but in fact, at the end of last year, FDA and NCATs together put together a drug repurposing workshop, and really the idea there was to, at the very least, try to clear up potential miscommunications between what many of us might perceive as FDA requirements for a repurposed drug strategy versus what the FDA really wants to see, or what the FDA would like to see in the future. Because I think the FDA has made very clear that they're also very interested in clarifying and facilitating paths to repurposing drugs, whether they're small molecules, as you say, or biologics or gene therapies. So that's definitely a work in progress, but I think this kind of collaborative problem solving with the FDA is really going to be very critical in the future to support things like broad repurposing efforts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Loeb. So I would then sort of ask Dr. Korshitz what he thinks. So Dr. Korshitz has been a friend of the ABC from the get-go, from when it was started, a couple of decades ago almost. And he has worked with the ABC leadership team over the years, and on so many different levels. And there are lots of emerging opportunities for developing drugs, for addressing the origins of neurological diseases, The Brain Initiative is such a big and exciting thing. Walter, I don't know if you remember what the original question is, but could you riff on some of those things?
Yeah, sure, Matt. Thanks very much. And I think I just wanted to hit a couple of points that weren't brought out, but I think maybe cross-cutting that multi-institutes are involved in as well. The first is in terms of COVID-19. I guess just to point out that NIH is, I think, working full speed, and hasn't really slowed us down in the work that we do on the extramural side. The grants are coming in, things are really working with people working remotely. However, if we look at the research going on, that has taken a big hit. So we're still only about 50% occupancy in our labs here, and I think that's probably true across the country, maybe even worse across the country. And so some of the projects, particularly those who had to enroll patients, you have to get to 1,000 patients for a trial. They basically lost a year, and so there's going to be a bill that's going to come that we're going to have to pay at some point for this kind of stopping of particularly the clinical research, but also some of the other research resources that have been lost. So I think it's important when talking about COVID that there is a significant financial impact, that some of it's hit us already, but most of it's going to come later as things were supposed to end and can't. I'd also say that NIH has been doing a lot in the research space in COVID, and you hear about that in the newspapers. But from the neuroscience standpoint, there's pretty good evidence that I'm not sure how many people, but COVID can have some pretty devastating effects on brain function. So you can get strokes, you can get leakage of blood-brain barrier, you get inflammation, little hemorrhages, and so that we also need to try and understand how that happens, how frequently it is, and that leads into the other area, which is just kind of coming to fruition, and that's looking at people who are no longer acutely infected, but are still having trouble weeks, sometimes months out past their infection. So those problems are primarily the ones that are most devastating, are primarily related to the brain. People complain that they can't concentrate as well, their memory's not as good, they have a lot of fatigue. There are other things thrown in, particularly pain, coughing, sense of dyspnea when their lungs seem normal. So there's a lot to understand in this group of people as we go forward. And in terms of ABC, in terms of this issue, these are folks who kind of fall between the cracks, not just the COVID patients, but the groups that we work with, the chronic fatigue syndrome patients, devastating illness and not really kind of embraced by the neurological community. But I think that's an important thing to throw out there. The second thing I think on our list is particularly a lot of discussions and work going on at NIH about improving diversity and equity and inclusion. So lots of things going on, but I just say on the neuroscience side, the data that we have in terms of the percentage of neurologists who are African Americans is about 2%, what I understand. Our R01 awardees who are African American is probably 1%. So I'm not sure about what the other institutes would say, but clearly attracting people into neuroscience from diverse backgrounds has got to be a very high priority. And that's, NIH has some levers to pull, but then I think, trying to motivate people to go into neuroscience area, it's usually not the government that gets you to do this. It's disease organizations or the science organizations that get people hooked. And then I guess the last thing, there's two more things I wanted to throw out. One is the Brain Initiative, which ABC has been so supportive of, is really, it's really unbelievable now. Things are just moving so fast and by leaps and bounds. So John Nye came from UC Berkeley to run the Brain Initiative. He's the director now. It's a $500 million a year project, and it's going to completely transform how we think about neurology, psychiatry, substance abuse disorders. The big project that's going to be coming out soon in publications is this cell census project, which is identifying all the different cell types in the mouse, the marmoset, the human parts of the brain, and setting us up for real Manhattan projects to come in the next phase of the Brain Initiative that will, really change the way we think about brain circuits and the information we have about them. And part of that to mention is that, a lot of the stuff is done in the mouse, and it looks really interesting. You can pretty much do anything you want to a mouse's brain now. You can turn on this neuron, that neuron, turn them off. But there are some aspects of human behavior that are not approachable in the mouse, and really the next step is to go to the non-human primate. So we know that ABC has been supportive of that in the past, but it's actually more important now because it's the circuits of the non-human primate that are closest to the human. And now we have this ability to look at circuits we never had before. And so the non-human primate is going to be even more important than ever. And then the last thing I just throw out in terms of maybe riffing over what Don mentioned is that there is, on the FDA's part, a lot of interest in developing a pathway for gene therapies for ultra-rare disorders. And it's Peter Marks, who's at the FDA, who's been the lead there. And so a number of institutes, particularly NCATs and ourselves, NHLBI, been working to develop programs where genomic therapy, for us, it's going to be antisense and gene therapies, can be tested in ultra-rare neurogenetic disorders. So we have a program that Nina Shore is leading. It's called Urgent, and it will hopefully get gene therapy into these ultra-rare disorders, 10 years before they would otherwise. Those are the main points that I wanted to throw out there, Matt, but I really appreciate ABC's support over all this time. And there's a lot more to do, though.
Thank you, Walter. And let me ask you and the rest of the panelists, what's the biggest banana peel in the way to your success? What are obstacles that need to overcome? And if they're policy related, how can we help you?
Well, I would say that one major obstacle is the one that I think it was Josh who brought it up, or Walter, is the notion of that with COVID, universities have been affected very negatively, so that the levels of resources that they had have been decimated. And this is particularly problematic for everyone in research, but I think those that are most vulnerable are the young scientists. And so many of the job offers that have been given to some of them have been rescinded, and many are losing jobs. So to me, an area that we really need to protect and devote emphasis is how to protect this young generation of scientists, neuroscientists, researchers, because they are coming at a stage which is, I think, extraordinarily challenging to start a career.
Thanks, Dr. Volkov. Along those lines, we have wondered at the level of the university, which is important for turning out the scientists who turn out the cures, how do we credit young members who are team scientists who aren't necessarily the first author or the last author, but doing good work and may end up somewhere in the middle, and how do we credit them for their contribution? So that's something we need to think about culturally here in the university, which I think matters for getting people new jobs, getting them good letters of recommendation. Can you think of any way that universities can help? Do you have any concrete thoughts on that?
Yeah, but I'd like to also hear my other colleagues at the NIH that certainly have ideas.
Yeah.
I think Nora is highlighting a really important point. So I think part of this is that we have tried to, I think many of the institutes on this call have really tried to be as flexible as possible, especially during COVID, and extending the time of fellowship, extending supplements to keep folks in training programs so that we can give them a little bit more of a glide path to their careers. But in terms of what you just mentioned, in terms of giving credit, I think there have been some models that we've seen even related to tools or methodologies and common credits, where, you know, if they've developed an imaging algorithm, or they've developed some type of machine learning properties, or they've developed a specific methodology that may not merit a publication, but that does receive common credit to use that as part of tenure. We've seen that in some of our imaging studies. We've also seen that in some of the studies that we've sponsored, where people are using deep learning or machine learning algorithms to look at available major cell census or cell census experiments or genetic experiments. So I think looking at things other than publications and finding new ways to credit the young scientists who may have advanced computational skills or advanced analytic skills is really one of the ways that we've seen people getting more credit and finding new things to put on their CVs. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing that I will say is also finding ways to engage, and I agree there's a note in the chat, but I think the other piece of this is looking at the universities as also extenders. And to Walter's point, you know, when NIH goes to fund trainees and new scientists, we're looking at much farther forward than maybe some of you can in terms of community reach. And back to Josh's point, we really are trying to figure out how to increase, and Walter's point, increase the diversity of the scientists in the field in ways that we can think about, and we'd love to hear ideas, ways to increase our outreach so we get earlier in the pipeline. And we encourage these scientists very, very early on. I do outreach myself when we were in person to schools and do neuroscience, you know, essentially displays on neuromuscular inputs to prosthetics, right? And kids go nuts. They're like, how do we do that? And, you know, that's the secret sauce, right? Going into low income or underserved schools and getting them excited about science and seeing why they need math and science to move forward. So I think there's lots of ways that the community can get involved to both help us build the pipeline, but also to preserve the scientists who are at that juncture point where they need to transition to independent careers. We're trying to help, but we can't do it alone.
Thanks, Dr. Cernick, for augmenting Dr. Volkov's points. Anybody else like to add to that?
Yeah, maybe I can jump in with at least some partial solution or partial approach. So as you say, translation especially is really fundamentally a team science, and to be able to take a new drug candidate, and even on the preclinical side, just to get it into phase 1 clinical trial, that's a task that will take half a dozen different disciplines, 50 people, 100 people, lots of money, lots of time. And that kind of work generally isn't publishable in the single name journals in Nature or Science. And so what you bring up, the issue, the incentive structures that put high pressure and value on first and last authorship are kind of fundamentally incompatible with the kind of team science that you need for effective translation. So it is a huge, huge challenge. And we all really need to work together to be able to provide credit, the kinds of credit that especially young scientists need. So the one small step that we've tried to make at NCATS is that the entire research program, so the intramural program, has been set up without PIs. So in fact, none of us at NCATS have tenure, and we aren't reviewed in the same way. So that has some material problems, but what we get as a trade-off is that we're much freer to work together as teams. So we don't have publication pressures on a 4-year basis as most PI systems do. And it's still an experiment since we've only been around for 9 years, but I think our productivity has been very good, and I think this non-PI system has been very supportive of the kind of team science you need for effective translation. On the other hand, could you implement this kind of different structure in the academic setting, for example? I can't quite see that would be very easy to do, but I think we do have to somehow come to a different way of structuring team sciences and according credit, and be able to give people the kinds of credit they need for career advancement, but at the same time be able to accommodate team structures that we need for effective translation.
Thanks, Dr. Lowe. Any other comments? Dr. Gordon, Dr. Koroshetz, Dr. Hodis?
I don't know that adds a lot, but I mean, to take upon all that you've heard, I think it's clear that the specific issue we're talking about giving credit, fostering careers, is not in the domain of any one agency, but has to be the product of collaboration. For NIH to judge merit often depends on the same or similar peer review to what goes into publications, or that for tenure decisions at universities. So it's the academic system, it's the journals, it's NIH peer review, and NIH administrative decisions, all of which have to converge on a real conviction to make a difference. We can't do it in isolation, no one of us.
Thank you. Other comments?
One example is out there. I mentioned the Brain Initiative, the Big Cell Census Project. There might be 200 authors on that. That's the biggest team project neuroscience has ever done, I think. Now, that being said, the foundation was heavily the Allen Brain Institute, where it's a brain institute and people are hired and employed as a team. So it's a great example that there's alternative ways that the universities could start looking at how to do things. And they get funded because they have a monopoly on being able to do that. So there may be other ways universities can do this. I know, for instance, Jeff Kahn at Vanderbilt, Don may know that, runs a translational program, Barbara Schlosser at Hopkins, and those are more in this kind of new team science mode. And so there are some examples to look for out there.
Thank you. If there are no other comments, I want to acknowledge that there are some from the audience, and including some questions. And I want to acknowledge a question from John Lair. They're not necessarily all about COVID or career development. He's a board member from the Parkinson's Foundation, and he had a particular question for Dr. Volkoff, and he wanted to know, what is the current best thinking about helping people overcome opioid addiction, which is, of course, a big national problem?
Yeah, no, and I mean, certainly we've been thinking about this now for several years, and everybody has convened on actually trying to identify 3 strategies that have been shown to significantly enable people to recover from addiction, opioid addiction, but importantly, to prevent them from overdosing and dying. And that one of them, number 1, is expanding the use of medications for opioid use disorder. And that can be buprenorphine, that can be methadone or naltrexone. The second one, which also has been challenging, relates to extending retention in treatment. Because even though these medications are quite effective in preventing people from relapsing or overdosing, they work only if the people take them. And the discontinuation of these medications overall in average is close to 50% at 6 months. So a major focus right now is what is it that we can do to retain patients in treatment. And then the third one relates to distribution of naloxone. I mean, it's one of those circumstances where we do have a drug that's almost miraculous in that it reverses the overdose and you save lives, provided that you administer it on time, and which actually relates very much to the fact that that drug is widely available as possible. So these are the 3 strategies where the effort has been focused upon. We're also very interested on the other component too, because as we're facing the COVID crisis, we're seeing the increases in people that are taking opioids and relapsing and dying. And so the issue of prevention, I mean, the concept about how do you prevent opioid use disorder, and a key strategy there has been one that Walter has been leading on, which is how do we develop models for treating patients with severe chronic pain that can obviate the use of opioids, and what is the research basis that's necessary to also for us learn when we are using opioids, how to do it in a safe way. And ideally, to another aspect, very challenging but extraordinarily important, is to accelerate the development of effective medications for pain that are non-addictive. So this is what I would say as the top strategies.
Thanks, Dr. Volkov. Any comments about fentanyl making it back into the U.S. under different names?
Yeah, that's a very really challenging situation because fentanyl has always been sort of like in the back with a very few cases of overdose deaths, perhaps 100. But now we have many more overdose fatalities from fentanyl and analogs. In 2019, is close to 32,000 people dying from fentanyl, and this is fentanyl coming from the black market. It's believed to come predominantly from China. It's not staying at fentanyl, and there's basically description of new molecules that makes it also harder to identify them because they are not recognized by the DEAs as illicit. It also makes it easier for the dealers to move them around. All of these are synthetics. All of them are extremely potent opioids. So they have very, very high affinity for the mu-opioid receptor, very fast pharmacokinetics. So they are highly toxic, highly addictive, and also harder to revert overdoses because it gets into the brain so rapidly that sometimes the patients die when they're in the process of injecting. I mean, they don't even have the time to actually remove the needle and they lose consciousness. Of course, that makes it so much harder to revert. And so, yes, it is a challenge. I don't think it's going to be a challenge that's going to go away. I think that into the future, we're going to see an expansion of synthetic chemistry to come up with increasingly more powerful drugs. This is what technology does, and is basically hitting the market of substance use.
Thank you so much. Now back to a question that is COVID related, and it relates to the susceptibilities in long-term care. And this is from Paul Arovich. Thank you, Paul. So the question is, please comment on the unmet needs for the COVID behavioral health epidemic affecting long-term care and congregate living facilities ranging from pediatrics to geriatrics, and negatively impacted by the silos between ID, TBI, SMI, dementia, and other. Anybody want to handle that one?
I think you've heard from a number of us already about the importance in targeting research, including COVID research, to the issue of particularly vulnerable and underrepresented populations. And this is really very much along those themes. And I think just about everyone you've spoken to today and all of our colleagues are conducting a good bit of research that you heard Josh's focus on RADx, UP for underrepresented populations, designed very much to understand how we can contact these populations, conduct surveillance in the light of coming availability of such interventions as highly effective vaccines, to determine how we can achieve acceptability and accessibility to vaccines in these populations as well. So the NIA, as you know, would have a strong focus on that end of the lifespan in community living in the form of nursing homes and assisted living. And a good bit of research, including the collaboratory I mentioned now, is taking research out into those communities to make sure that we can identify solutions that work best there. Just one point connection I want to make is we're talking about lifespan. Following up on Allison's comments about the importance of looking at some of the developmental abnormalities around Down syndrome, many, but perhaps not all will realize that arguably the largest at-risk population for Alzheimer's disease is Down syndrome. So the connection between development and degenerative diseases in later years is critical, and that has made Child Health Institute and NIA and other institutes, strong partners in these common convergences.
Thank you,
and
Jeff.
just to add to Richard's point, I think the Include project, which I think some of the groups on this call have advocated for, which is really a focused study on the risks and benefits, honestly, with respect to, for example, solid tumor cancers for people with Down syndrome. I think we are really understanding the links at a very basic level, as well as at a clinical level, as he mentioned, for some of the neurodegenerative diseases and the developmental disorders. And so I think those types of projects that we can do together, where we do really cross the lifespan and better understand the development of those diseases from very early ages, can help also in therapeutics development and also in preventive strategies. So I think, and also to highlight with RADx UP, there are a number of funded studies that are non-diagnostically specific, but are looking at congregate living facilities. And so it's not targeted necessarily to a diagnostic group. It is really targeted to those people who are in congregate facilities, and that can be homeless, that can be individuals with substance abuse, that can also be individuals with developmental conditions or traumatic injuries and or people with neurodegenerative disorders. So I think that initiative really does look not diagnostically, but really is a facility level, what we can do to better serve those populations.
Thanks so much, Dr. Cernick. Thanks, Dr. Hodes, for pulling together the threads from our earlier conversation and synthesizing them. Great answer for Paul Arovich. And now, Katie, I want to ask you if you can unmute Robin, because I see he has a question.
Hi. Am I on?
Yes, we hear you.
Sorry, I was writing my question, taking too long. I realize, first of all, I want to thank all of the panelists. This is really an amazing team. And we're very fortunate that you've all found a way to come together to give your expertise to our group today. I'm sure we all share my enthusiasm and my gratitude for that. My question has to do more with the other end of the research process. NIH historically does more in basic research and translational research. When you look at the COVID crisis, which is on top of all of our minds, the challenge there, as I understand it, is mostly at the other end. It's creating immediately, urgently new treatments at the other end of the research process. My question is, given the fact that we have, after just 9 months, not one, but two very promising candidates for major interventions, which at least to my lay mind is quite astonishing. Is there anything we've learned from this process that has broader implications for medical research in general and brain research in general in particular?
Well, I think that's a great question, Robin, and we did learn a lot. I guess what we learned is that things that usually take 8 years, like making a vaccine, can be done in 8 months. So it begs the question of what the hell was going on over those 8 years. And then, but I think what we don't know is how and we got to think about this, is how do we take advantage of, say, this public-private partnership that Warp Speed put together for, really bad things like the tens of thousands of people who die of suicide every year. So we have lots of crises, health crises, and this one, I think, showed us that you can really make hay if you get everybody on board.
So
why don't we do that all the time is the question.
I'm going to take this occasion to radically disagree with my good close friend and colleague, Walter.
Okay.
This was not a 9-month immediate response to COVID. This was a decades-long systematic way of developing a program where you could, once you understood the sequence of a virus, you could create a vaccine within weeks. The Vaccine Research Center, NIAID, colleagues across the NIH and other organizations said, how are we going to deal with future pandemics? And they did this decades ago. And they created this mRNA vaccine process. And I don't know how long that took. I don't know how much money it took, but there's a whole freaking building on the NIH campus essentially dedicated to that and other vaccines. This was really, really well thought out in advance. How do we create a platform so that when we do get a new virus, this can happen? And this was the first time it worked. First time. And it's,
yeah, but I think that, and absolutely, and I think that you're absolutely right in saying it's coming in a decade, but I think that there were other things that came around that to me are one of the big lessons, and our ability to work together as agencies. And also the ability to change the rules. I mean, so the concept is it takes a certain amount of time, and the government agencies sometimes get very, very sort of confident and take these timelines as everything goes so slowly. And here we learn that those deadlines can be broken. And once they've been broken, you know that in the next time one can move them. But you need the will. And I think that that was, for example, as you look at the opioid crisis that has been there for 2 decades, and it has been moving in terms of the level of resources that are being placed, very, very limited. But the same thing with mental health, and the level of resources placed on it are limited. And the involvement of industry has also been very limited. And in the case of mental health, less so and less so. In substance use disorder is basically non-existent until very recently and very minimally. So it is the knowledge and the science that allows you, but it's also creating, I guess perhaps that's what you were aiming to do in terms of an architecture that allows for the different players to come together, and the will and the resources to do it. And that's what made it possible. So, well, that's certainly, to me, a very clear-cut lesson, that we can break the so-called deadlines and the expectation that everything takes forever.
I think you obviously hit a point here where all of us have strong feelings, and not inconsistent at all, but agreeing with all my colleagues. I think we have to beware of mistakes such as thinking we have to spend less time worrying about basic science and rather deal with translation. This translation couldn't have happened, as Josh points out, without the basic science. We have to continue to build it along with our abilities to overcome barriers, administrative barriers. All of that has to happen. And we can't sacrifice for expediency what appeared to be the limiting factor in one case at 1 month over time. It really does take it all. We're gonna have to continue basic science to build the opportunities, and then have the mechanisms, of course, to translate them more efficiently as well.
Maybe I can jump on that thought. So to hugely agree with everyone, and Josh's great point that the infrastructure, the science, the people, and the will were all there for vaccine development. But kind of threading back to some of the other topics in our discussion today on team science and repurposing and translation, there in that realm, I think. COVID therapeutic response kind of has hit up against the same kind of barriers that we've been talking about. And so these are intellectual property barriers, publication pressures to be first or last author, issues in data sharing, regulatory problems, kind of standard speed bumps or valleys of death in the repurposing effort. So if we can use COVID-19 and the positive and negative lessons learned to be, so next time around in drug repurposing, let's say, to be in the same position we were for RNA vaccine development this time, we'll be in really, really good shape. But
yeah, I think, and just to add on to Donald's point, and I think to tie back to a couple other things, the only other thing that I would say to add to my colleagues is we have some particular limitations with some populations. So for example, children. And going back to what Nora and I started with, nobody's texting vaccine in children. And we're going to still have vulnerabilities in that population, right? We've started with adults, same with pregnant women. And luckily we don't have potentially vertical transmission and the neurodevelopmental effects that we saw with Zika. But I think, children, individuals who usually get excluded from some trials because of their comorbidities, I think we're going to have those concerns going forward with some of these trials and whether or not we're going to have efficacy in those populations. And I do think that we have to watch from a population perspective to make sure that when we do have a crisis like this, that we have strategies for the populations, especially with conditions, which many of you represent, that we really have to think about how do we include those people. And, like RADx UP did for our underrepresented populations, people with health disparities and vulnerabilities, how do we better target those populations so that when we have these effective platforms, when we have the infrastructure to address it, that we can include it. And I think that's one of the things that we learned a little bit later. And I think we're going to have to keep learning that lesson. You know, we're going to be looking at the long haul and the rehabilitation needs for people who are severely impacted. Those are going to go on for quite some time. And we're still learning about that. And I don't think the other policy pieces, I do not think that we have a strategy to address some of the long-term disabling conditions that will result from this pandemic. And that is something that I do think, both from a mental health perspective, behavioral health perspective, as well as from a neurologic condition perspective, as well as potentially some of the things that people may engage in because of the economic costs of this pandemic. So I do think that we have some problems we still need to face. We had great response with a specific product, but I don't think this is over from a lot of different perspectives.
Thank you very much. Dr. Cernick, I want to mention this is a great discussion. It's good to hear that great minds don't always think alike, and that there's a lot to be gained from the synthesis and discussion. Our time is growing short. I just want to acknowledge a couple of other comments. I want to apologize to people on the chat. I can't read everything that's there, but I have a couple of things. One of them is that Andrew Sperling, who's one of our board members from NAMI, commented that Pfizer didn't participate in or take resources from Operation Warp Speed.
That's not true. I mean, Operation Warp Speed is paying for their doses. So so they did not participate in ACTIVE, which I think was the platform that did the trials for the vaccine. That was partly the partnership between NIH and industry. But just to clarify, Operation Warp Speed includes purchasing doses, which they did benefit from.
Thank you for the clarification. I also want to acknowledge a comment from Manny DeChico Bloom, and he's one of our board members, and he asks, given the emerging links of child and adult disorders, Downs and AD, are there mechanisms to distribute funds focused on neurodegeneration to develop neurodevelopmental disorders?
Well, I think as Allison and I know well, the answer is certainly yes in some circumstances, and maybe there should be more. So as alluded to, one of the major collaborations we have, using, I think quite appropriately, some of the funds targeted by Congress to Alzheimer's and related dementias, has been to set up longitudinal studies and the infrastructure for clinical trials involving individuals with Down syndromes and those developmental disorders in diagnostic and biomarker and basic biology and in clinical trials. So it needs to happen, and I think it is happening. Certainly could be more extensive. We've heard about other areas like the basic science around the connectome and brain, which has pediatric and geriatric and midlife and disease components added to a common infrastructure, which I think enriches all of them. And I think maybe others on the call want to amplify, but the answer is certainly a yes, and a good bit of it is happening, and I'm sure there'll be more.
Thank you, Dr. Hodes. And I want to say that I think we've drawn to the end of our time. We are deeply grateful to you for all of the help that you've given us in your discussion today, which was useful and fruitful and enlightening and exciting. So thank you, Dr. Cernick, Dr. Gordon, Dr. Hodes, Dr. Koroshetz, Dr. Lowe, Dr. Volkoff. You raised a lot of themes today, a lot of issues that go from basic science to translating to the community and social return on investment. We will think about all that you've given us today. We want to know how we can help. So we'll think about it, and we look forward to working with you and your institutes and making things better together. So thank you very much. I want to thank our membership for joining us today. Thank you to our board members. And I guess we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.